So my name is Carolyn Ramsey, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you this morning. I live in Pleasantville, New York, and I'm going to talk about my experiences enhancing my green thumb in Pleasantville over the last several years. My presentation is going to feature a lot of community members whom I've worked with over the years. And this on the front page is my daughter Aria, who is the big appreciator of heirloom tomatoes in my family. I have 4 kids, and this one was born loving tomatoes and loving being in the garden. The others have learned over time, and we'll talk about what that means to engage children. The first topic I'd like to talk about is how school gardens can play a wonderful role in connecting children to nature, getting them excited about creatures and plants, and getting them thinking about the food supply, where food comes from, and how food helps us be as strong as we can be. I would like to point out that what I think the key to getting children excited is lots of hands-on experience, opportunity to explore and play, and a freedom they don't get in a typical desk or table classroom setting. Also, I'd like to talk about creating magical moments and what's magical to children. And I'm going to show you some examples of things that have been really successful in elementary children's school gardens. In addition to growing things, I think a key to getting the engagement and commitment of children and families is harvesting, cooking, and tasting together. I'm going to talk about whole foods versus processed foods, which is a concept that really gets children thinking about, again, how they're powering their bodies. If all of this gardening with children talk has you excited and thinking maybe you'd like to do a little garden with your children or your grandchildren, I'm going to talk about starting a home vegetable garden. What are some of the key decisions you need to make and how to make it a success? And lastly, I'm going to finish with how we can support our pollinators step by step. And what that means is planting some host plants for caterpillars, some nectar plants for insects and birds, and habitat for birds, insects, and other creatures. So let's start with bringing school gardens to life. This is a picture in the edible garden at Bedford Road School in Pleasantville, and it's a group of first graders who are harvesting their first radishes. At our school, we have every grade from K to 4 in the garden several times a year, as hands-on as possible. And I often get the question, what does it take to make a school garden successful? I think the big starting point is a strong connection to the administration, either by connecting directly to the science teachers and the curriculum coordinators and or the PTA. These things kind of start at the top. And if you can get your principal and the head of your PTA and curriculum coordinator excited and committed to help with funding, I think everything that comes afterwards is going to be a lot easier. It's critical that the garden be supported by the school so that you have the wherewithal to deliver the programs that are beneficial to the children. And we're going to talk through some of the specific programs that we've had wonderful successes with. I'd like to start with kindergarten. So at Bedford Road School, the kindergarten children come into the garden for the first time 2 or 3 weeks after school starts in September. And I love this program. It's a scavenger hunt. So what's beneficial about this program is that the kids get to see the garden bounty, what was planted by other children in the spring, and they get to learn what makes the garden work. And this is where I love to ask them questions and start getting them involved. Does anybody have a garden? Does your grandma have a garden? What's in the garden? And, they say the funniest things, they say the cutest things. I ask them, what's your favorite fruit? Would you like to grow that in our garden? Start from the very first day they enter the garden, getting them excited, telling their stories, creating their stories, and understanding the process. So, to that end, every year, a couple of weeks before school starts, we go into the garden and we take pictures of what is going to be ready to harvest or easy to see when the kids come in. And this particular year, we had some corn, we had some pumpkins, some green beans, tomatoes, peppers, and I happened to catch a couple of insects on the pollinator plants. So I took pictures of all of these things and made this scavenger hunt sheet. Every year it's a little different depending on, what's there in the garden. And as you see here, we have a group of kindergartners sitting around the table. They have had the chance to harvest a few tomatoes and peppers, and they're looking at their sheets, and we're talking about what does it take to grow a garden, and getting them engaged. What can we do if we want to plant inside and we don't have any sun? And the children will think about it and think about it, and somebody will raise their hand and say, can we use a light? Well, yes, we can. So really getting the children engaged and participating in whatever way is comfortable and fun for them. This is a key to starting out. Letting them run around and move their bodies. Our children spend a lot of time sitting in chairs, and they need to move their bodies. I have two fifth graders, and my son, from the day he started school, said his favorite subject was recess. And I think it's because he gets to move. So designing programs for the children so they can run around the garden, move their bodies, and find things is key to making it engaging for them. Let them touch anything. Try to teach them respect of the creatures especially, but learning how different types of leaves feel, how different types of seeds feel, how some vegetables are firm and other vegetables are soft. Talk and share their ideas. And then they take home this pretty scavenger hunt sheet at the end. Another thing we do is we will email the parents of every class that visits the garden and tell them what happened. Today, your children harvested tomatoes and peppers, and we tasted them together, and we did a scavenger hunt so they know all about what it takes to make a garden. So if the subject comes up at the dinner table, the parents have a chance to engage and reinforce what the kids are excited about. Now, the garden itself, I talked about letting the kids run around. One of the things we did pretty quickly after I got involved in the garden, which has been more than 10 years now, is we got magnifying glasses and clipboards. So the kids can look, they can touch, they can magnify, they can see different things and compare and contrast. I love to say, go run around the garden and bring me back 5 or different types of seeds. Well, what do you notice about where the seeds are in the cucumber and the tomato versus where the seeds are in the strawberry? And they're so excited to tell us what they discover. So really letting them be hands-on is really important. Another thing we really have focused on in the last 6 years is getting the kids thinking about and excited about creatures, especially pollinators. So I try to have most of the plants that are in the school garden also in my home garden. In the upper right corner here, this is some bronze fennel, which is a host plant for swallowtail caterpillars. So if I have swallowtail caterpillars in my home garden, I'll take them into school and the kids can watch them crawl around and sometimes see them eat and sometimes see the cocoons and even see them eat clothes. We talk about bees and pollen all the time, but the kids don't really see it much. So we've been lucky, we've attracted a lot of bees to our pollinator garden in the context of the edible garden. And the kids are starting to see a bee covered with pollen, a bee with bags of pollen, and it gets them thinking about how nature is working around them. Creature magic. I love this bee in the upper right corner with bags of pollen so heavy, you know he's about to take them and deposit them for the hive. In this left corner, this is one of my favorite events. We've been taking monarch butterflies, milkweed, and caterpillars to the Pleasantville Farmers Market in the early fall every year for the last few years before COVID, so that the kids could again see and interact with the creatures. If you've never pet a monarch caterpillar, you would be amazed how soft they are. And these children are just enchanted to have this ability to interact. And, you know, it gives them sort of a soft spot in their heart for these creatures. And I think that's an important teaching as well. We have a couple of girls in the lower left here who have dug up some worms, and they're having fun with those. And one day I was in the garden and a boy came up to me, Mrs. Ramsey, I found the chrysalis. And I said, well, where is it? He said, on the corn. I said, are you sure? Because the corn patch was pretty far from the milkweed, maybe 10 feet. But we went and we looked, and there it was. And he was just so thrilled to have discovered it. So sending them around to observe and find creatures and discover things has been a great tool for us. And sometimes they're a little unsure and nervous, but over time, they just love it. I also try to get small videos of things going on in nature that might not be happening in their school garden, and then sharing those with them. So we plant this plant in the edible garden. It's called Mexican sunflower. It is not a native plant. You can guess probably because of the name Mexican, but it is a plant beloved by monarchs, and it blooms for weeks and weeks and weeks. And sometimes I will have a dozen monarchs on a single plant in my garden. So this particular day, I captured a little bit of video of them flitting it around and shared it with the children. They love that. In addition to that, I want to show you this video of a monarch eclosing. She's coming out, or maybe he. Oh, there we go. There we go. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So tiny. It's magic. I know that they're folded a lot. So if you can hear the video, you can see just how excited the children are to see this special moment. There is quite a bit of debate about whether it's helpful to monarchs or not to remove them from nature and raise them inside in cages and re-release them. I can't say I don't know the answer to that question, but what I can say is by taking some out of nature and raising them and sharing them with the children, we're creating an awareness and a love and a fascination of what these natural processes are and how much work it takes for nature to run its course. So in that sense, I think it's a huge benefit for the children. And so every year we take many in and let the children watch them evolve. So the hands-on magic isn't just seeing and touching, it's also exploring by tasting. Now, when I was first involved in the school garden, I had many children say, no, I'm not trying that. And I talked to a nutritionist and asked, do you have any suggestions to get kids to try vegetables? And she said, sit down next to them and taste first. And also ask them specific questions like, do you like the red tomato or the yellow tomato better? Do you think the orange carrot is sweeter or the purple carrot is sweeter? And I started using some of these tricks in the garden. And over time, I've had many, many children who were initially reluctant actually start to try and enjoy vegetables and enter the garden a couple of years later. Mrs. Ramsey, what are we cooking today? So these boys here on the left have just harvested 7 or 8 different colors of carrots and 4 or 5 different colors of beets. I love these bright colors, and so do they. And they're just thrilled to get a chance to harvest and taste. And again, sitting with them and saying, what do you like better? Empowering them to have opinions and choices has helped a lot. And you can see from some of their faces, they don't care for the raw beets necessarily, but they're trying. And this is teaching them to explore the world. And I think that's a big part of what we're doing with them. In addition to harvesting, we've tried to cook with the children as much as possible. When I first started in Bedford Road School, when we would harvest cucumbers, for example, I would make several different kinds of pickles at home and take them in and talk about, why do we make pickles? Why did our great grandparents preserve fruits and vegetables in the summertime, and kind of get them thinking about that. We've had some challenges in recent years due to allergy and cross-contamination concerns, so we don't do that as much. But as you can see, wherever possible, when I'm working with children, and often my own children, I'm trying to get them excited about what's growing and making it pretty and fun to taste. So here on the upper left, we've harvested baby kale and arugula and violets from our garden and made a salad, and the kids make their own dressing. I chopped up an apple because I had it nearby, and I think the crunch of an apple, which most kids really like, in the salad kind of makes it a little bit familiar as well as new. So that mix of familiar and new kind of gets them going. These are my 3 kids in the middle, and those poor guys don't have a choice. As part of their contribution to the family, they go outside and they help harvest, and they do a lot of cooking. My son says he doesn't like tomatoes, but he loves to make the different colors into a salad and present that. And he loves pizza, so he'll cook down the tomatoes and we'll have a family pizza night. And I think that's another way their friends have also gotten really into it. We'll make our own homemade tomato sauce and can it for the winter. And some of these are things our grandparents used to do, and it's very exciting to get the children involved. They absolutely love it. When is Tomato Day, Mom? And what friends can we invite over to do it with us this year? Are we making tomato confit, which is a family favorite? It's a concentrated roasted tomato, easy to pop in the freezer, and then it's wonderful with pasta or on bread with cheese. It's just great. And so getting these kids hands-on, learning to cook with their harvest and tasting their own cooking is another way to get them really engaged. Strawberries is a great way to start. If you were making a small garden and you said, what 3 plants are kids going to be excited about? I would say baby cucumbers, cherry tomatoes, and strawberries. Most kids are excited and willing to try those. And there's just something about strawberries. They're so marvelously shiny when you harvest them. And then empowering them, what would you like to make with these strawberries? Can we make strawberry shortcake? Well, of course we can. And then make that from scratch. They really, really enjoy that. I started a few minutes ago with my favorite lesson for kindergartners, which is the scavenger hunt. In the 4th grade, that's where Bedford Road School ends for the children. And my favorite final lesson for the 4th graders is a lesson about whole foods versus processed foods. And it's a game we play called the corn relay. This came to be because one of the kids said to me one day, "Mrs. Ramsey, are calories bad?" And I thought this was such an interesting question. And I said, no, calories are our fuel. We need them. You need at least 1,000 every day. They're really important. but some calories are better than others. And the calories in the fresh food that we grow are some of the most powerful calories that we can consume. And so we created a program where we started by getting the kids engaged. What do they like to do? How do they like to use their bodies? So, who likes sports? Raise your hand. Who likes to dance? Who likes reading? Who likes playing music? What do you like to do? And then everyone is engaged. And then we talk about how whole foods give us the most power to do what we like to do. When I started this program about 8 years ago, it was very noticeable how much processed corn was in many of the typical simple foods that we would buy at the grocery store. If you bought a package of bread or rolls, very often they had corn syrup. If you bought a can of soup, it often had both corn syrup and cornstarch. There were all kinds of items that had corn derivatives in them, but not so much fresh corn. And corn is a fun one because we grow it. It's dramatic what it does in the garden. And the children tend to really like corn on the cob. So we teach them how corn on the cob has protein, fiber, vitamins, minerals, and healthy fats. And by the time you have it in a factory being processed and dried and ground and handled, it becomes a white powder called cornstarch, or it becomes a clear liquid called corn syrup. And there's not as much nutrition and not as diverse a set of nutrition in that. And the lights really begin to go on. The children understand this. So once they get this lesson, we get to the fun part, which is the game. Usually we have about 20 kids in a class, and I like to divide them into 3 groups. For each group, I make a box which has 7 or 8 products that I found at a common supermarket, which have corn or corn derivatives in them. Obvious things would be corn tortilla chips. Maybe less obvious things would be marshmallows or Sprite soda or different kinds of crackers, barbecue sauce, all kinds of things. So each box has 7 or 8 items with a corn derivative and 1 item that has no corn products in it. I set the boxes in different places in the garden and put the kids in 3 lines, and they have a relay race. Each child runs to a box, has to look at the ingredient label and identify 1 item with corn and run and bring it back to the table. Now, what makes it a challenge is that many of these kids have never read an ingredient label before. So this is a wonderful tool we're giving them to think about what food choices they're making going forward. So they will go, and I usually have a parent volunteer helping that so they can find the label, and they're looking for corn or a corn derivative. And if they find a product, they bring it back. And I always, to give it a little bit of an edge, I tell them they have to bring something with corn. If they find the product that has no corn, their team is disqualified. And for some reason that gets them very excited and very engaged. And so they go and they find these products and they come back. And then again, it's a big conversation as a group. What surprised you? One year I got frozen meatballs that had dextrose and corn syrup. And they said, why would you have corn in meatballs? It should be meat. And I love the way they're starting to think about this. Pop-Tarts also had a lot of corn. And, I said to the kids, if you were making Pop-Tarts at home with maybe your grandma, what would you put in it? And they start thinking, well, maybe flour and sugar and butter and eggs. And I said, and so what do you see on this label that's different from that? And they said, dextrose. I said, that's a little hard to say. What about this one? Mono and diglycerides. And we get into a conversation about if it's really, really hard to pronounce and you're in 4th grade, then maybe it's a chemical. Maybe we should look it up and see if it's something that's going to help us be stronger or something that's intended to preserve the food for longer shelf life. So I just love this program because it gives us an opportunity to have the children really think about where their food is coming from and how to power their bodies. And they love this program as well. I think it's one of their favorites. And I'll run into them or their parents in town or in the supermarket, and they'll say, "Oh, Mrs. Ramsey, we just bought this and we read the ingredients and it's filled with protein and fiber. So we're going to be strong for our football game." So it's just really a great tool for them. So if this conversation has you excited and thinking about perhaps a vegetable garden, I wanted to say a few words about how you might start one at home. These are some of the high level questions that you would want to explore, and why you would want to do this. Flavor is a big one. There's nothing like a homegrown tomato for beautiful flavor and freshness. And you have the opportunity to be pesticide free and avoid chemicals if you're growing it yourself. And it's great for the environment as well. Being in the garden gives you some exercise and a connection to nature. In our family, it's become a tradition. When are we going to start planting seeds? When will the radishes be ready? When will we make tomato sauce in the early fall? And introducing the youth to gardening. Questions you need to decide. What do you want to grow? Some people really love a diversity of things. Other people say, if I can have my fresh herbs that I can just go pick, so when I'm cooking, I can get a few leaves of basil, that would be wonderful. Where do you want to grow it? And it's important to think, how much time would you like to spend? I wanted to say that if you're going to start small, some easier things to grow are listed here. I love sugar snap peas and lettuce. You can plant them on the earlier side of things, and they're just wonderful fresh from the garden. Tomatoes are my personal favorite. I've been accused of being obsessed with tomatoes, and I think it's true. And zucchini is a fun one because usually they grow super big, bigger than you ever imagined, and you can feed the neighborhood. A little harder, but also exciting, are corn, melons, and peppers. Corn can be challenging because you need to grow a lot for proper pollination. And if you don't have proper pollination, the ears don't develop well. Melons really want to be grown in a warmer place than Westchester County. And peppers grow well, but they take a little bit of time if you're starting them from seed. Where? So when we bought our current house about 10 years ago, there was no time to build a vegetable garden initially. So that's when I started to get involved in foodscaping. I started planting kale, Swiss chard, and cherry tomatoes in the middle of my perennial beds. And I just love it because these are beautiful plants. They add color, and I can harvest and enjoy the produce at the same time. I also really enjoy patio containers. And then, of course, converting grass to veggie gardens is another wonderful option. It takes a bit more time and legwork to do that. The question about how much time you want to spend is important. If you just have a cherry tomato plant in a container on your deck, you're going to spend a few minutes each week, quite reasonable. You can have a 4x4 foot garden or a few container plants and a small amount of time. Once your garden gets a lot bigger, it's going to be more of a commitment. And I recommend starting small and expanding as you go. Planning ahead will save you time and money, of course. And you be resourceful. I had dug up quite a few rocks that were in the ground, in the dirt. And I used those to build a raised bed in one section. And little by little, I dug up more rocks and used those to make the raised beds over time. And this was very helpful to me. And you can see here a little template for a possible 8x8 garden, a few tomato plants, some cucumbers, bush beans, Swiss chard and kale, lettuce, peppers, zucchini, and you can add some herbs. It's really whatever you're excited about growing. One super important thing to consider is location. You need certain things to be successful. Level ground is important. Being close to water is going to be important if we have drought, and sometimes we do. Southern exposure is really the best way to go because your plants need that sunlight to develop and grow strong. 6 to 8 hours is what's recommended. And protection from critters, oh dear, we do have problems with both deer and rabbits. And so you need to plan to protect from those creatures. I love raised bed gardening. This picture on the right shows the new raised bed gardens that we put together at Bedford Road School a few years ago. We did a lot of research to try to identify what would work well and last at least 10 years. These particular beds are made of cedar, which is grown in Vermont. So these were made and grown in the US. And what was wonderful is we were able to find beds that the children could put together themselves. So there's no hardware here. It's all 100% cedar. So we had the fourth graders, after they did the corn relay, build these garden beds and gift them to the school upon their departure. And that was a really nice thing that we did. Raised beds, advantages that are worth considering: they warm up much more quickly in the spring and they drain well. So you have less compaction and erosion than in a grass level garden that you built. You can increase the available rooting area if your raised beds are deep enough. These here are 24 inches high, so they're quite deep. And you can produce a much greater yield per square foot when you have this increased rooting area. There are also disadvantages worth considering. They're expensive, but this was an investment with a hope for 10 years. And there's the issue of drying out quickly. Any of us who have hanging baskets or container plants in July understand that this happens. We try to put a couple of inch layer of leaves or shredded bark on top to help mulch and keep the soil as uniformly moist as we can. Container gardening, we also use in the schools and at home. You know, one container, you can grow lettuce and harvest every several days for weeks. It's just wonderful. You can use anything that can hold soil, but you don't want to use garden soil because it's too heavy and won't drain well. So you'll need commercial potting soil or one of these soilless mixtures. Also need to consider size. There are many beautiful 8-inch pots, but they dry out very quickly and they can't support the root systems enough for something like tomatoes. So you'll need a big 5-gallon bucket for tomatoes and at least a 2 or 3 gallon bucket for other vegetables. You want a sunny location and you'll need, again, to water frequently, which may mean morning and evening in the hot summer days. Fertilization, using compost, hopefully, if the potting soil isn't self-feeding, is going to help your crops as well. So, you know, beautiful soil really is what leads to beautiful produce. This picture on the right is from my garden about the second week of August. I love the diversity of colors and different types that we can try and enjoy. I use composted manure composted leaves, grass clippings, and we eat a lot of vegetables at home and compost those in our garden as well. And organic matter is much more powerful than the commercial fertilizers because it decomposes slowly, and every time it rains, it decomposes and adds more nutrients to the soil. If you're starting a new garden and you can only pick one tomato variety to grow, I must suggest a variety called Sun Gold. It's a bright yellow orange, and it's rated a 10 on the Brix scale, which is a sweetness scale. And it's just almost like candy, especially to children. It is one of my very favorite cherry tomatoes. It's prolific, it's beautiful, it's fabulous. And since we're talking about tomatoes and I admitted to my obsession, I wanted to mention that I do love to grow heirloom tomatoes. I discovered a book 15 or 20 years ago called 100 Heirloom Tomatoes for American Gardens. I like this book for many reasons. One of them is that the author tested 1,200 different varieties of tomatoes in the Albany, New York area. So many gardening books are written by gardeners on the West Coast. This woman tested all these varieties in soil and environment much more similar to ours. So the characteristics that she reports are likely to be reproduced in our gardens as well. And I've made wonderful discoveries using her book. I'd like to move now to the final topic, which is how pollinators can play a larger role in home gardens.
Carolyn, it's Adrienne.
Yes.
I'd just like to, we do have one question before we go any further about
Sure.
the school gardens. So if I could just interject. The
Yes.
question is, who cares for the gardens during the summer?
Oh, that's a terrific question. At Bedford Road School, what we do is we make a garden plan and we invite families to each adopt the garden for a week. So it's about 10 or 11 weeks, I think. And what we'll do is say, okay, first week of July, we need watering if it's not raining, we need weeding, and we need final harvesting of lettuces and so forth. Second week of July, we need XYZ. So we make a to-do list and we invite families to adopt a week, and we encourage them to take home whatever produce is ready when they're in there. And, you know, a mom or a dad or a grandma with whatever kids are in the family and available will come 2 or 3 times each week and manage the garden. And that system has worked very well. And then the last 2 weeks before school starts, we will tell them, please don't harvest any tomatoes. Please don't harvest any peppers. The kids are going to be harvesting these first thing when they come back to school. So we leave instructions and we leave it up to the families, and garden committee members will stop by once in a while as they're able to check on things.
Okay, thank you. And then just one other question.
Sure.
The funding, how are the gardens funded?
Yes, so in our school and many schools where I've worked, the gardens are funded by the PTA. In addition to the PTA, we have done fundraisers. We've done fundraisers with pollinator plants. We have done fundraisers with seeds, different things ourselves. And we've also applied for government grants to do different projects for the garden. So there are a lot of different funding sources. And I think it's a really important question. The year after I started volunteering in this garden, I asked what the budget was, and people said, well, what do you need? And I said, well, this week we need starter plants, but we're going to need some more compost and we're going to need this and that. And so I created a budget which said, you know, these are the things we need to buy every year, such as seeds, seed starting mix, starter plants, and compost. And these are things we may need to buy every 3 years and things we need to buy every 10 years. And I tried to be very transparent about how I saw the budgeting so that nobody would be surprised when we asked for money.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right. So I'd like to get into this final topic of pollinators in the garden. Pollinators is a term we're hearing more and more these days. And some gardeners I've talked to and some friends have said, oh God, I don't want to pull out my whole garden and replace it with all those native plants. It's just too much. And what can I do? And what I would say is it's a little by little, step by step process, and it doesn't have to be 100%. Habitat is anything that supports life, and simple things like not cutting off all the stems of your plants in the fall to clean up your garden, but leaving some stems there provides habitat for many different solitary bees and other insects that will lay eggs in the dead stem. Leaving plants unpruned until late spring, this creates habitat. So you don't have to add a tree necessarily. You can add habitat by changing some of your practices. Host plants is another one. If you look in the picture on the right here, this is parsley. And one year I discovered that I had caterpillars all over my parsley. And then I learned that these were swallowtails. Well, I bought another parsley plant so that they could have some and I could have some. And every year I have done that to have more of the host plants so that I could feed the caterpillars. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then nectar plants, this is where they get the sugars and calories they need to finish their life cycles. On the lower left here is a plant I adore called agastache, and it has sort of pale lavender flowers that last for several weeks. I love blues and purples, and I had Russian sage in a particular spot in my garden for quite a few years, but it started looking scraggly and I just couldn't get the look I wanted. And somebody said, well, why don't you take it out and put in agastache? I said, what's agastache? And they said, oh, it's a wonderful nectar plant to support pollinators. I said, okay, I'll give it a try. Well, I planted it and I love it so much that I now have it in 4 or 5 different spots. So adding nectar plants that give you pleasure is another way to support pollinators. And then leaving the seed heads on a bit longer helps. Coneflowers is a wonderful plant that has a dusty rose sort of petal, but it also has this cone-shaped seed head in the center. And when the flower is dead, we get goldfinches coming constantly to eat those seed heads. So whereas 10 years ago, I might have cut off the seed heads, now I leave all my seed heads on as a way to support the pollinators, and I don't cut them back until April. So a little bit about my own explorations. I started actively adding small pieces of pollinators to my garden in about 2014. The agastache is an example of that. By 2016, I started creating pollinator gardens for the schools and also for the village of Pleasantville. And by 2018, people were really starting to talk more and more, and we started offering pollinator packages as part of different fundraisers that I was involved in the community. And this is a way to encourage people to give them a try, take them home and support in a small way. And it's been a good success. So, what was my thinking when I got involved with pollinators? To be honest, the conversation for me started with monarch butterflies as I read the population was diminishing, and bees as I read the populations were diminishing. It's evolved a little bit, and in the last about 5 years, I've been thinking more about birds. What got me to thinking about that was reading from Doug Tallamy, who is a wonderful naturalist who's really done great scientific research on pollinators and how to support them. He told me that a single pair of birds, chickadees, needs at least 5,000 insects, mostly caterpillars, to raise a clutch of babies. So the poor mom lays 5 eggs and she needs 1,000 caterpillars per egg to raise them to adulthood. And mostly caterpillars, because those are soft and they won't scratch their delicate throats as they're growing. And if you think about it, where are you going to find 5,000 caterpillars? Well, these butterflies and moths need host plants, the plants with the leaves that their babies, the caterpillars, are able to chew. And many of these species need particular plants to do this. So the reason milkweed is such a big topic is that monarchs only eat milkweed. So if a monarch butterfly comes to, for example, a butterfly bush and drinks the nectar, and she lays her eggs on that bush, the babies will die. If the eggs hatch, they can't eat the butterfly bush. They can only eat the leaves of milkweed and different milkweed varieties. So that's why it's so important to have host plants, because these caterpillars need specific food to be able to grow, and our birds need those caterpillars to survive. So native trees, shrubs, and host plants will help solve these issues. In my garden and the gardens I build, I aim for about 70% native beauty. And I add things that I love that are not native as well. So here I'm going to show you some early spring shots from my garden. This wonderful plant on the left is called Virginia bluebells. And I love it because it kind of pops up out of nowhere. When the leaves first come up, they have a burgundy tinge to them. And then over time, they become this intense green with this incredible periwinkle blue. And they last for several weeks. And then one day, the whole thing is gone. They're a particular type of native called ephemeral, and the leaves completely disappear for several months, but they come back the following spring. So I do love these Virginia bluebells, and I intersperse them in among many different woodland areas and shady areas in my garden. In the middle here is another fun one called bloodroot. This is a close-up, and this is a nice stand of it, so it's dramatic. But even if it's just a cute little flower here or there, you're providing an early pollen source and supporting the creatures that depend on it. So I highly recommend these. Later in the spring, I have some other Baptisia on the left. This is the big flowing purplish flower, and some other nectar plants which are going to attract the pollinators. In the middle, again, I have the Mertensia, the Virginia bluebells, which is fading out. And then in the center, I have a super cool, absolutely not native epimedium that I got for Mother's Day about 10 years ago, one day when I went to the botanical gardens. So I think you should buy plants you fall in love with. They don't all have to be native, but it's nice to have a few natives to support the wildlife. On the right here is one of my very favorite native trees. This is called serviceberry or Juneberry. This particular one I have in the Bedford Road School Garden, which incidentally was originally designed by the Westchester County Cooperative Extension before my time. They did a beautiful job, and they put in this beautiful serviceberry tree. It has small floral interest in May, but then you get these incredible berries, which start pale, go to deep pink, and then deep blue purplish, and they support tons and tons of birds and insects. And the leaves are a wonderful red in the fall. In the summertime, again, I have a real diversity I have many natives, a lot of milkweed in here, but I also have things that we love as a family. My husband sadly isn't a big gardener, but he just absolutely loves the variegated, beautiful leaves of the canna lilies. So I put those in there as well for him. And another non-native, which I plant prolifically, is zinnias. Zinnias draw all kinds of pollinators, birds, bees, butterflies for weeks and weeks. And you can cut them, make wonderful bouquets. They're a family favorite. Back to the subject of pollinators for host plants. On the left here, I have a group of monarch caterpillars munching on milkweed. In the middle, I have a spice bush plant with the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar. And on the right, parsley with the swallowtail caterpillar. As you can see, these creatures are just munching away, and they're either going to turn into beautiful butterflies or be food for birds, and both are wonderful choices. Late season plants that I wasn't growing 20 years ago, but I love now. The first one I wanted to mention is Joe Pieweed. The native form of this can be 6 feet tall and likes to be in wettish spots. But over the years, people have developed other varieties. There's a variety called Little Joe, for example, which is only 3 feet tall and is much more flexible about whether it gets its wet feet or not. It's a fantastic plant, supports many, many bees. It's covered with bees, butterflies, and also the seeds support some varieties of birds. The other one worth really mentioning for late season interest is asters. When I was a kid, my parents would typically plant chrysanthemums in the fall, and they were always in the store. And unfortunately, they didn't often come back the following year, so they weren't a true perennial. Well, asters is a fantastic choice. They do come back every year, and they are a natural pollinator source. They're one of the last stops for the monarch butterflies right before they began their migration south. So they're just really a terrific choice. So again, just to summarize, my green thumb, which I've been developing in Pleasantville the last 20 years, for me, it's meant a strong community connection through the schools, an outdoor classroom of sorts for my family, a place where I can support wildlife and pollinators, beautiful colors and textures to enjoy, and bountiful produce. So this is what it means to me to develop a green thumb, and I wish all of you a wonderful gardening season this year.